Yes, good evening, everyone. This is Reasonable Faith Adelaide. I'm Steve White, and I'm going to introduce Geoff Russell, who tonight will be speaking without the use of slides on the topic, does religion cause wars? I'll now hand over to Geoff, ask him to introduce himself. Just a reminder that we have a chat box down the bottom of this presentation. So anyone's viewing, if you'd like to record your comments there, and after Geoff's finished, then we'll run through the comments. Over to you, Geoff.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody later viewing this online or by recording. The question is, does religion cause wars? Well, I've got a simple answer to provide to that question: yes and no. Actually, the question is ridiculous, as are the possible answers, either in the affirmative, that religion does cause wars, or negative, that religion does not cause wars. Religion is not capable of causing wars. It's people who engage in wars. Religion is just a set of ideas, whether it's coherent or not, whether it's ancient or modern, whether it's extensive or simplistic, but it's just a series of statements. So the question should be rephrased like this: do people who are adherents of a religion cause wars? Now, even in this simple clarifying adjustment, the emphasis has shifted from religion to people, the adherents of one religion or another. And that's the question I'll set out to answer. Do people who are adherents of a religion cause wars? Okay, people who fight wars have sometimes been motivated by the religion that they profess. Religion has sometimes been used by people to bolster the willingness and reputation of the people on one side of a conflict, and conversely to blacken the name of those people on the other side. And some wars have been fought by people in the name of a particular religion, by one side at least, and often by both sides. Now, I acknowledge from the outset of my address that all those statements I've just put forward, all those statements are true. But when a careful analysis is undertaken of the cause of wars, specific wars, it is found that religion is less significant than several other factors, and that the particular religion of Christianity is even less significant than religion in general as a cause for war. We'll delve into such analyses later in my address. Now, some people have asserted that religion is a cause for wars. Some go further and claim that religion is the cause of wars. But this is a delusion in several respects, and people who make such claims are deluded, or worse. This viewpoint becomes an excuse for them to deride religion and to be hostile to anyone religious, to actually be warlike themselves. And if they gained sufficient following and encouraged their followers into a heightened mood, they'd cause a war themselves. Now, of course, the irony of this is completely lost on such activists. This anti-religious stance and everything that goes along with it is actually their religion. Such people are often more religious in that sense and more zealous about their religion than many adherents of conventionally understood religions. We need to define what is meant by religion. Often, those who are belligerent in their assertions about religion being the cause of wars use self-serving definitions. They say that religion is a worldview based on faith in some supernatural being, some God. Well, this immediately misses at least one of the five big world religions, that is Buddhism. which is actually atheistic or at least agnostic with regard to God, so that belief in God or gods is not really a part of the religion of Buddhism at all. So you can see that the way such antagonists define religion doesn't do justice to even the 5 major world religions. Now, these antagonists often assert that religious faith, they understand that religion means having faith in something, but they assert that quite often that religious faith means trusting in something or somebody, trusting in that in the absence of evidence, or even against evidence, against reason. Now, this is nonsense. It's pure nonsense, but this is how such people often define faith. They also fail to acknowledge that faith is essential for every person, everywhere, to function every moment of every day. Now, let me illustrate what I mean by that. And here's a simple illustration. You're driving a vehicle and you stop at an intersection where a traffic signal is displaying red in your vision. The signal changes to display a green light instead, so you drive ahead across the intersection. But how do you know that the traffic signal is showing red to the crossroad? You can't see it, so you can't know for sure that it's showing red. You have faith. You have faith in those who designed the traffic signals. You have faith in those who installed them. And you have faith in those who maintain them. That is faith. You also have faith in the other road users, that they will actually stop their vehicle at a traffic signal displaying red. You don't know, you can't know for sure that they will. You trust that they will. That is faith. You have faith in those drivers and faith in those authorities that issue driving licenses and those that police our roads. That is faith. There are countless situations every day, every moment of every day, where faith is exercised. Labelling on packaged foods is another. So is actually sitting on a chair. You exercise faith when you just pull the chair up and sit on it. Daily life is actually impossible without the exercise of faith. It's not blind faith. It's not faith without evidence. It's a faith based on evidence. It's reasonable faith. But the antagonists in our consideration tonight, the antagonists of those of people who adhere to a religion, the antagonists want to target just religious faith. Okay, so let's consider religious faith. Religious faith is a certain worldview, just as much as other worldviews. Most, if not all people, and I think it is all people have a worldview. They may not have thought things through. They may not be able to articulate their worldview or define its features, but they have a worldview nonetheless, by which they live day by day, moment by moment. And that worldview is akin to religion, and it's based on faith. Every worldview has certain underlying assumptions. Perhaps then we should talk about worldviews rather than religions. Communism, socialism, and other political philosophies are virtually religions, even if they're not called that. Some adherents of these philosophies are very passionate about their systems. Think of Nazism, which is actually National Socialism, for example. In our modern society, the Greens Party and all their subsets are virtually religious. Now, not surprisingly, the antagonists that we've been considering, they ignore all these religions. they want to target conventional religions, and specifically one, Christianity. They can be forthright in their attacks in our Western societies where conventional religion is in decline, but cowards that they are, you don't see them making such a bold stand in countries that are majority Islamic, for example. No, their target generally is Christianity. But for the sake of argument, let's consider conventional religions and just conventional religions. Many scholarly investigations have been undertaken into the causes of wars, and I've consulted that great authority, Wikipedia, and I'm quoting now from an article in that organisation. The article is entitled "Religious War," and I've got a paragraph to quote here. So this is my quote. According to the Encyclopedia of Wars, now I haven't consulted that, but that's referenced in this article, and it's a 3-volume comprehensive treatise about all known and recorded wars. Anyway, this is what Wikipedia puts forward, according to the Encyclopedia of Wars, out of all 1,763 known and recorded historical conflicts, 121, that is 6.87% to be precise, had religion as their primary cause. Out of these scholars that have done all this investigation, they have concluded that it's 6.87% of all conflicts that they've been able to analyse have been caused by religion. Now, going on in this quotation from Wikipedia, Matthew White, he's an author, of The Great Big Book of Horrible Things. Once again, I haven't consulted this book, but it sounds like it would be pretty interesting. This book by Matthew White gives religion as the primary cause of 11 of the world's 11 deadliest atrocities. Okay, 11, that's 11%. That's pretty terrible, but that means there's 89% of the 100 deadliest atrocities that have been committed in world history that don't have religion as the primary cause, according to that scholar. The article is worth reading, and I'd commend it to you. One of the things it does quite early in the article, it includes discussion about the difficulty in defining religion, just as I've been bringing forward in this in my address tonight. And even where religion is a factor, there are many other more significant factors in play most of the time. For example, political aspects, social aspects, economic aspects. And these factors are more significant, these authors conclude, these scholars conclude, than religion. And when we come to consider recent history, like the entire 20th century, the big conflicts of the 20th century have not been on the basis of religion, yet they've been the deadliest conflicts, the most terrible atrocities in world history. They're not on the basis of religion. The number of casualties from World Wars I and II has vastly exceeded all previous conflicts. Now listen to these statements again from 2 Wikipedia articles. From the first article, this is World War I casualties, and I'm quoting. The total number of military and civilian casualties in World War I was about 40 million. Estimates range from around 15 to 22 million deaths and about 23 million wounded military personnel, making it among the deadliest conflicts in human history. The total number of deaths includes from 9 to 11 million military personnel. The civilian death toll was about 6 to 13 million. And this hasn't got anything to do with religion. Religion was not really a factor, certainly not a significant factor in this terrible worldwide conflict. However, that, as terrible as it's been, has been exceeded. Here's Wikipedia article, a quotation from it, on World War II casualties. World War II was the deadliest military conflict in history. An estimated total of 70 to 85 million people perished, or about 3% of the 2.3 billion people, an estimate at the time of the Earth in 1940. Deaths directly caused by the war, including military and civilian fatalities, are estimated at 50 to 56 million, with an additional estimated 19 to 28 million deaths from war-related disease and famine. Civilian deaths totaled 50 to 55 million. Military deaths from all causes totaled 21 to 25 million, including deaths in captivity of about 5 million prisoners of war. We don't need to look any further than these two dreadful worldwide catastrophes on an enormous scale. They weren't about religion. So we don't need to look any further. That's more than enough to debunk the ridiculous notion that adherents of religion are the cause of all wars, or even of most wars. Now, I've got a far more realistic proposition to put up to counter those propositions we've been talking about so far. Listen to this proposition. Wars are caused by breathing. All wars, without exception, are caused by people breathing. People breathe and they cause wars. Where people are not breathing, they don't cause wars, not even a single war. If only we could eliminate breathing, there'd be no more wars. Does anyone dispute that? It seems to me to be 100% accurate. It's completely different from the propositions we considered earlier. Wars have been a part of human history from the beginning of recorded history. There's always been violence perpetrated by human beings towards other human beings. Why is that so? We'll come to that later. Now, I first want to consider why some people, often loud and belligerent in their manner, whether their broadcasting is oral or in writing, why some people would seek to attribute all wars to adherents of religion, something that's obviously false. Why would they do this? Are they ignorant of the facts? Are they liars? And if so, what's their motive? I think that they seek to suppress people who have religious convictions. They're intolerant of religious people, and they want to eliminate any talk of religion from the public arena. And in this way, they think that they'll avoid personal accountability to God. They want to live their own lives free from accountability, no matter how much that infringes the rights of others. But as in other things, they're deluded in this matter too. No one, absolutely no one, will avoid accountability to God, the God who made everything, including themselves. Everyone will eventually have to answer to God. Of course, they deny this too. But such a view of things, that is, an understanding of the personal accountability to God, would be cause for restraint in human behaviour, while the opposite view means that there's no restraint on a person's behaviour. Who knows what they might do when they don't sense any accountability to God. So where do wars come from? Well, the Christian view, based on the Bible, is that the human race has fallen from grace. Excuse me. The very first human pair rebelled against God, choosing not to submit to his good and wise authority. The effects of that rebellion, that is sin in Bible terms, have been inherited by every descendant of that first pair, right down to our day. But we can't just blame our ancestors for this, for the state of affairs. Every human being since that first pair has likewise, in principle, rebelled against God and shares responsibility for the human condition. The inclination to intimidation and violence and to warfare comes from within every human being, from deep within them, from what the Bible calls the heart. Now, this doesn't refer to the organ inside the human chest that pumps blood around one's body. It is a figure of speech for the seat of life or strength. I'm quoting someone here. It is a figure of speech for mind or soul, spirit, or one's entire emotional nature and understanding. This horrible inclination to these things, to intimidation and violence and warfare, is very deep inside each one of us. And it's always there, and too often we give way to it to one degree or another. When enough people align in the way that they follow that inclination of their heart, a war can easily result. And the war could be about anything at all, not necessarily religion. During the time of Jesus' ministry on earth, people were very concerned to identify the source of human uncleanness, of defilement, of contamination. Some thought it came from eating the wrong foods, or from not washing one's hands properly before eating, that was the cause of defilement and contamination and uncleanness. They were about as deluded in this as the anti-religious antagonists we mentioned earlier. Listen to what Jesus said. I'm quoting here using the New International Version of the Bible from Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15, verses 19 to 20. This is what Jesus said in response to such people and their thoughts. Jesus said this: "Out of the heart come evil thoughts like these: murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander." Notice that the first he mentions is murder. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. Now, I'm sure that Jesus did not intend his list of evil thoughts that he's mentioned here to be comprehensive. They're the prime examples he's put after that, and the first of which is murder. But he could easily have included war in that list, couldn't he? Well, are we trapped in this situation? If it arises from the human heart, from every human heart, are we trapped in that? What's to be done about this dreadful mess that we're in? Well, in a nutshell, Jesus is the answer. Jesus alone. He's the only answer. One of his titles is Prince of Peace. Now, this is far more than just a respectful title for a great man. It encapsulates what he's all about. He's the bringer of peace in two ways. He brings peace to individuals, and he will bring peace to the whole world. Firstly, Jesus gives his peace, a deep, abiding peace, to every individual who sincerely believes in him and who submits to him. He gives this treasure to them, and only to them, and not to others who don't believe in him. Jesus said this, recorded in John chapter 14 and verse 27. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. So do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid, whatever the outward circumstances, whatever situation of conflict and even war that you find yourselves in. Jesus gives peace to his followers. It's true peace. And secondly, he will bring peace to the world. It hasn't happened yet. The time is not yet, but it will surely come. However, it won't come about except through his future work of judgment and outpouring of wrath as he subdues everything that opposes God. Peace, universal abiding peace. That is the day we long for, and it will surely come. The Bible tells us a huge amount about all this. When it does come, when that day is completely realised, then it will be said, and here I quote from the New Testament, from the last book in the New Testament, from Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 and 18. This is what it says there of that day, prophetically. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, speaking of this Messiah acting for God. The time has come for judging the dead and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. Then, once all that happens, there will be no more war ever again. There'll only be peace, in accordance with the even more ancient prophecy of Isaiah. Isaiah wrote this in his 9th chapter, verse 7, speaking of Christ, though not naming him there. He says this, of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. May you too, friends, know that peace. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Geoff. That was good and well presented. Appreciate that. Look, I think we've only got 2 comments, so I'll just open them now and we'll see what we've got here. Okay, first of all, Kevin, just look here. You did give references for percentages. I don't know if you can provide those to Kevin so that he can perhaps put them in.
Well, actually, you can whack it in the chat.
Sorry, the percentages?
Yeah, what were the references that you actually used to get those percentages? You had a Wikipedia article.
Yeah, it was from Wikipedia. Yeah, so I'm sorry, Wikipedia's been the only authority I've consulted, but that in turn has quoted other things.
Well, how would you find it? So find those references.
The article from Wikipedia was religious war.
Okay.
Right. And then that referred in the article, there's a lot of material in the article, it's worth reading, but it referred to this Encyclopedia of Wars, which has been a very comprehensive study by scholars of all known and recorded historical conflicts. They say they've listed and evaluated 1,763 known and recorded historical conflicts. And from their analysis, they claim that 121 of those had religion as their primary cause. There'd be a lot more in that encyclopedia, but I haven't consulted it. So in their analysis, they reckon there was 6.87% of all known wars, all known conflicts, had religion as the primary cause. There could have been religious elements of lots of other wars. Religion is often brought into things, but it's not the prime cause. Mm-hmm. And then the article also quoted this other book by an author, Matthew White, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things. That does sound a little more populist, but that's what it is. And according to that fellow and the people who contributed to that book, religion is the primary cause of 11 of the world's 100 deadliest atrocities. The other articles I quoted from Wikipedia were just really about how terrible World War I and World War II has been in terms of fatality.
Yeah. It might be an idea if you sent me an email with those references and we can include it in the upload to YouTube.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, thanks for that one. Kevin, Bronwyn, would you like to clarify your comment, please?
Yes. I said, do you think the recent wave of modern terrorism has given some opportunity to say religious fervour causes war and conflict and brought this argument to the fore?
Yes, it may well have. Yeah, because terrorism, and I would say probably more particularly Muslim terrorism than anything else, is very prominent in the press sometimes. In the past, there's been some what you might call Christian terrorism, particularly in places like Northern Ireland, and much can be made of that. But overall, it's and we acknowledge these things, but they are small compared to the vast bulk of conflicts in history. A great many of the prime cause of them has been territorial disputes, succession disputes, and just political. And it's one of the greatest forces in these military things, in at least for the last 100 years, has been socialist and communist forces, which are overtly atheistic, intensely atheistic, but they've been very active and in a military kind of sense.
Could you argue the point that from a Christian point of view, Christians who actively engage in war, like not from a defensive type of point of view, but aggressive, are going against the ethos of what Christianity says? Yes,
that's true too. And this is how Christianity differs from other religions like Islam. And I talked about, it came into my talk, last talk about the origins of Islam. Islam's been very militaristic right from the start. Christianity, the Christian faith as the Christian practice eventually deteriorated, but it wasn't so from the beginning. Christians have been taught right from the start to turn the other cheek, to submit to rulers and authorities, and to not take part in those things.
And to love your enemies.
To love your enemies, that's right. It makes it pretty hard to go to war with them.
Well, would the Quran actually say they've got permission to actually fight? Does it sort of actually articulate that in the wording of their sacred texts?
Well, I think it does. Hundreds of times it does. Just that sort of thing. That they're justified in taking this up to the infidel and unbelievers.
Did you have any thoughts on Augustine's just war theories?
It's pretty hard to actually work out what is a just war. In principle, yes, you can go through the things he says, but when you come to look at a particular situation, very hard to determine that. And even if it was either as a whole movement or for individuals in it, it very quickly can change to being an unjust.
Was it just to oppose Hitler or the Japanese expansion?
Well, I'm very glad they were opposed. That's one thing, but personally, I don't know that a Christian should take part in it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Like defending. It's confusing, isn't it? Because Christ didn't actually tell the soldiers to put down their weapons, and
no, that's right.
He told the woman to go and sin no more. He told them your sins are forgiven, blah 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 blah. But we never hear him in Scripture. It was never articulated when the centurion comes for healing, or the other noted. Isn't there one who was a real generous person? Was he a Roman?
Yeah, a centurion actually turned to Jesus and said, "Would you heal my servant?"
Yes. So, but Jesus didn't say, yes, but I want you to stop killing people or taking part in the
know.
Roman persecution. Not once. So I do
No.
think there is room for for a united justice in the sense of defence
Yeah.
of someone's life. I did hear a very interesting podcast about some Christians in Africa and who were being persecuted by, people that would come in and just cut you up with machetes, and how they did defend themselves. Well, there's the rub, isn't it? This is the conflict where I think in the situation you'd have to ask the Lord's guidance.
Yeah.
And, he could actually transport you from one place to the other if he wanted to get you out of there. So it's not, but people do actually actively help, so.
Yeah, I understand that. And it is a difficult issue. I really do think that. And, taking John the Baptist, his statements about, what repentance involves and everything and how we should live before God, taking that in line with Jesus, because he was the forerunner of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, the soldiers came specifically to John and said, well, what shall we do? So they're asking what should we do, and what does John say to them? Just like you've said, he doesn't say, well, you've got to leave the army, you've got to not do this, anything, you've got to not act for the authorities in this kind of way. He tells them to be content with what they've got, to not falsely accuse anybody, to not misuse their position to extract stuff from people. And that's what he limits it to. So, I agree with what you're saying.
I mean, if someone came into my house intent on murdering my family, perhaps me, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But if it was someone like a little child or something, I would defend them. If I was in the classroom with my kids, I've told them, don't worry, I will not let you get hurt. I would not. I would do anything to save the children or my family in my care. So.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm a strong Christian, so
I can understand. I would do that. I would want to do the same. But there's a difference between defence and offence. With protecting people, vulnerable people, and then on being offensive to somebody else. And it's a pretty fine line because, well, how do you stop a person who's intent on who's got some murderous intent? I agree that's a very difficult issue.
Yeah.
If I may, I reflect many decades ago now that about 68 or 69, I just joined the Air Force a couple of years in, went to a church service, and maybe I was in uniform, I can't remember, but I was certainly buttonholed by someone in that church service and said, why are you in the Defence Forces? This is during the Vietnam War, and there certainly was a proportion of Christians, I'm not saying how many, that were definitely against us being in the Vietnam War.
Yeah, well, I won't go into all my background, but I grew up in a group that had a conscientious objection to military service, full stop. And I faced the court. I went to court to answer that because I was called up for national service, and I chose to go and have that heard. And I was granted what do you call it? Exemption. I was granted exemption on the basis of conscience because I could establish that I had it. But that was at the time of all this carry on about the Vietnam War. So, but my view was not that it was a Vietnam War type situation. Many around me were going on about that, but my view was about conflict overall. But I have since I can see it's a difficult issue, and have you ever seen that movie Hacksaw Ridge?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'd identify pretty closely with that fellow and he was dreadfully treated by his fellow Americans before he went there. But then how brave he turned out to be. He wasn't the least bit cowardly. It wasn't that he was being a coward. But he was a man of principle, and whether you agree with his principle, he was really quite a notable person, a very honourable, decent fellow. Yeah, it is a difficult thing. In the times of the Vietnam War, I mean, I didn't face I wasn't facing the, what do you call it, the displeasure of our society that, you're not going to defend their country or anything. But in times of World War II, people who took that stand would be under a lot of pressure and a lot of displeasure directed at them from
Yes.
fellows. And you can understand it. You can understand. I don't doubt that, but I don't know. It's a very difficult issue. I don't know quite what to think these days.
Geoff, I'd like to take you back to your statement. You said you were glad that Hitler was opposed, but you wouldn't participate. So that sounds as though you're happy for other people to do the dirty work for you.
No, not quite. I believe that God's in control of everything, and God actually had a purpose in Hitler. He has a purpose in every person who is in authority. And just like back in the Old Testament times, I mean, he used the Assyrians he used the Assyrians against his own people Israel for their discipline and everything. Well, the Assyrians, they were terrible people. They were cruel and they were the worst, the cruelest, most nasty people, and God used them. So he had a purpose in the Assyrian power of the day. And just like he has had a purpose in Hitler being where he was for as long as he was, he also had a purpose in Hitler coming to an end. That's in the way that he did. And in Germany being defeated and Japan being defeated and so on. But that's another matter as to whether I should take up, participate in the fight against these horrible forces. It's a big subject.
It was I actually saw something on the Falklands War last night. It was a bit of a history. It was a small battle at Goose Green a few days in after they'd invaded. The leader of the Paras was shot. His 2IC, who was a Christian, I believe a Catholic, then had to take over. And he had to pray. What should we do? His forces were being diminished. And being a Christian, he went down and prayed, Lord, what do you want me to do? And suddenly he had a vision. He went to the Argentinians under white flag and said, would you now surrender to save further loss of life? And under God's direction, it was apparently a real revelation. The Argentinian commander, who actually was commanding more troops than the Brits actually had, then laid down his arms. It was a prayer, said in honest, before God, what shall I do? And he saved bloodshed by asking for a surrender. And, that's where God can guide a soldier in battle if he's prepared to listen to what God directs.
Yeah.
I've got a question regarding the involvement of Christians in war. So Christians are being involved. I think the cause of Christianity is around about 2%. But what are some of the factors in Christianity that people could latch on to cause them to go to war? For examples being, what were the factors that prompted the Crusades? What were the factors that prompted Charlemagne to try and convert the Germanic tribes by force? There like with Charlemagne, his aim was to actually convert the Germans. So it was an evangelistic motive for him to actually resort to violence as he saw it for the cause of Christian faith. So what are some of these factors that could prompt violence, and how would you address it? You understand the question?
Yeah, but they're all human reasoning, the fact that we don't like to lose, we don't want to lose the influence we've got, we don't want to lose control of the territory we've got or the population, So they're all humanistic things.
I don't think so. If Charlemagne wanted to convert people, he wanted to convert the Germans to Christianity.
Yeah, but what was the
force?
what was the value of that conversion and how real was it?
I'm not saying it's a good idea.
Mm.
But it might be other factors, like in the Christian, within the Christian faith, that people could misuse to resort to violence.
Could it be a fact of because scripture in those days wasn't so readily available, they just had their own thoughts of what they thought God should do? You know, like I'm assuming that the Catholic or Church of England churches or whatever, they had domination over the scripture that wasn't open to everybody to have.
So Charlemagne couldn't read; he was illiterate, and the Pope at the time disagreed with Charlemagne, but Charlemagne responded, "You do your job, and I'll do mine." But like also there was the 30 Years' War, and in the wars in Europe, where there were battles between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, so you know, was that? Oh, you've got that doctrine, so we're actually going to fight against you.
Yeah, I think all these things are compromises with worldly attitudes that aren't ungodly and worldly attitudes, and it's on the other end of the other side of the coin from the issue of rice Christians. You know, like, well, what if I pay you something to become a Christian because I'm going to give you some goodies, you know, either in terms of material goods or healthcare or education or prospects for your children. Whatever it is, people go into these societies and then others will say, well, those people have become Christian because they're getting some material benefit, some obvious benefit out of it here and now. Is that real conversion? Is that really coming to Christ or not? And you know, these are very real considerations. That's the other side. Instead of there being war to make someone become a Christian, this is the other side of the thing. Let's pay people to become Christians. That's terrible too. That's just worldly and ungodly methods.
Okay. Well, thanks so far for the discussion, and thanks for bringing that point up, Bron. Now, do we have any other questions from any of the other listeners or viewers at the moment, please?
Yes, I have a question regarding the comment with the big numbers with the Second World War, for example. Could you comment a little bit, Geoff, about there is a spiritual side to the Japanese invasion and the Hitler agenda in Europe? So sometimes we say they're atheist or whatever, but there is a significant spiritual factor at work. So the question is a bit loaded in that, do we have the dear old devil trying to activate issues with the war agenda? I guess that's the question, just like we commented earlier about what's happening in the world today.
Yes, well, I think hostile spiritual forces are there behind all these things, and whether you call it the devil or other or lesser devilish beings, they are stirring up trouble all the time. Sometimes within a single person, sometimes in a community, sometimes on a national scale. And yes, I think there are spiritual overtones to all this.
Yeah, because for example, in Europe, there was all the comments made with Hitler that there was a praying side happening to resist, and Dunkirk, for example, and other examples where some people believe the prayer agenda is very important in any war conflict. So it's not just gun against gun, it's also seeing the spiritual dimension requires the prayer input.
Yep.
Indeed.
I think it's remarkable as you look back on the history of these things, like Dunkirk was a seeming, apparently, almost a miraculous escape, wasn't it? So to enable the Allied forces to continue, it was almost a disaster.
Mm.
And I've read a fair bit about World War II. It's quite fascinating, but Churchill was the man of the moment, and he only just came to power. He almost didn't get to that position. He seems to have been made for it, to lead the free world at that time, and for a fair time Britain was on its own. It all, looking at so many things, it all looks hanging on a thread. It could have fallen the other way so many times, but and I don't know whether as human beings we will ever be able to know really what is going on there. But God is in control. I do believe that. And he does it through human agents, like Churchill, for example. I don't mean that Churchill was, an absolute saint. I'm sure he wasn't. He's a human being like the rest of us. But God used him, and God had him there at that moment, and they were in such a critical situation that they just had to turn to him, and then he wasn't able to just click his fingers or anything. It was his life, completely work of dedication to over 6 years through that whole period to get Britain and the free world through that time at a huge cost.
And it certainly drove Britain to its knees, didn't it? It
did.
It drove them back to God. You had J.B. Phillips reading his new translation. You had C.S. Lewis giving, what was the right word, mere Christianity, all of which were being broadcast to the British people during that time.
Yeah. You could argue that the falling away in the Western world from Christianity, Christian faith, which has been quite dramatic over the last couple of decades, has come about because of the lack of conflict in the world. That during World War II, that's when the huge number of people in society generally were fearful and anxious. They turn to God. When times go well, we prosper relatively. Yes. We always argue about things as to whether this government or that government's doing the best thing, but overall, our society's prospered enormously, and we have benefited from peace. But what does that do spiritually to people?
Yes.
And again, I think God's in control of all these things too.
Well, it drove the Jews back to Palestine, didn't it? Back to Israel, which in the bigger scheme of things is probably answering prophecy.
I think it's been claimed that the biggest cause of loss of faith is wealth.
And yet, who doesn't want to be? Who doesn't want to be wealthy? I mean, we all like to have more. Absolutely, everyone. I think nobody.
The love of money rather than wealth in itself.
It's a love of money, but But we're all goaded in that direction all the time by the world.
We are, I think what's happening in Ukraine, I'm assuming there are a lot of Christians in Ukraine, and I know a lot of them have taken up arms and fought and died. So it's certainly a conflict at the moment that.
But it's not really affecting the Western world overall, is it? I mean, I'm not minimising the tragedy. It's terrible, but it's not really affecting us here in Australia, is it? It's not.
Well,
only very peripherally.
You could argue oil prices and house prices and things like that have sort of drifted up because of that conflict. Definitely oil and stuff. So. And the price of food definitely is associated with it. Cost of living could be actually attributed to the war in Ukraine. Partly. Okay. I mean, considering that Ukraine was like 30% of the world's, was it 20 or 30% of the world's
wheat?
Grain, wheat, So, I mean, that's huge. So, what if that's not produced? Everything has to go up, doesn't it? So.
Well, one might say the war in Ukraine does have something to do with religion, because remember, the Russian Orthodox faith spread out of Kiev and went north into Moscow, and the whole Russian Orthodox Church has its great foundation in being united with Ukraine. That's where their faith came from. And then to see Ukraine wanting to be separate from them is a real, contradiction to their faith.
Yeah.
So at least some in the Orthodox Church are right behind Putin in reinvading Ukraine, so that this Orthodox vision of itself being a united country, which originated its faith, its Christian faith, from Ukraine, Kiev in particular, is what it's meant to be.
I never realised that.
Yeah. The Russian Orthodox faith places its origin from the Christian faith that came out of Kiev and came to Moscow. And many of the Orthodox faith have that as part of their historic foundation as to why the two nations are one.
Well, they've changed the day they've changed the day they or Christmas. They're going to change the
That's
date.
right.
Of Christmas.
They are. Yes, that's right. Yes, yes.
Yeah, but it's also very nationalistic. I mean, it does have this religious overtone, but it's also to do with national pride and nationalism.
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's where faith and nationalism too often have united, and one's corrupted the other.
That's right.
There's I don't know whether you've heard of him, but I've heard him speak myself, and he's a very humble bloke pastor called Sunday Adelaide, who's an African Nigerian pastor who probably for the last 30 years probably been in Ukraine, had one of the biggest churches in Ukraine, and he's black. A very dynamic preacher, evangelist, set up a lot of social reform. And when war broke out, he would have had a church of easily 5, perhaps 10,000, over a number of places. And when war broke out, their church got decimated.
Yes.
But he said he's made comments that a lot of people were ending up in Europe. He said where you could say Christianity's sort of faltering, and the people with a real passion for Christ have sort of lost their edge. And he's saying that here is little disciples of Christ that have gone from his church, and he is very dynamic, are being spread throughout Europe. So it will be interesting to see their influence, because they will make one. Yeah. Yeah. So very interesting guy. Very humble. So
good.
It's good. So good things will come out of it, I suppose.
Well, thanks for that, Ron. That's good to hear. Right. Anyone else wish to make a comment?
I just had another question of Geoff. In your research and interest, do you get involved in some of the debate about Gog Magog that seems to generate a bit of discussion amongst Christians in terms of where the world's headed?
Yeah, not in recent years. That goes way back in my past. I mean, I know it's a biblical issue. Ezekiel 37:38 in particular. Rosh, which means the head. Rosh, the prince of Meshach, and Tubal, and all these things. Yes, and in my far distant past, I was very much into, with others, into trying to work out who these and what these prophetic names meant and who it relates to in the modern world. It occupies my mind far less than it used to.
Well, how do you kind of make sense? What's it in there for? Do we just kind of throw up our hands and say it's beyond our comprehension and move on to other topics?
No, it can be worked out, and it probably is to do with northern powers. You couple this with the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, work out where some of these, what people groups these are, how they relate to others. Yes, but one of the problems with all this, I think, Trevor, is the assumption that, well, we must be living in the last days now. And unfortunately, well, I don't know. Right through Christian history, it's at least for the last couple of hundred years when we've got documents and books to consider. People have thought that they've interpreted things as what's going on right now. This must be in fulfillment of this and that and the other prophecy, and it's just gone on and on. So, and then the world powers change and people modify their views, but always the viewpoint is put forward that we're right on the cusp of all these things happening, but this must be this power, this must be this world power, and so on. It's not very helpful. In the end, I think it can actually be damaging to faith. I know, look, again, from my own experience, I came to personal faith really in 1967, and I was baptized then. That's when I can really see this as a long process. But my view, particularly the community I was in 1967, that was the 6-Day War. It looked like Israel was facing an existential threat. It looked very, very grim for them, with the Arab nations around ganging up against them, invading. Of course, it turned out to be a spectacular success on Israel's part at repulsing them, and unfortunately led to their hubris afterwards. But nonetheless, about that time, I felt that this really was the end of the world, and that it must be that Christ's second coming, the end of all things, was right on the doorstep. I got so engrossed in all these things and following the news of everything that was happening, I could hardly sleep, honestly, for all through that period. So, and yet it was 50 years ago.
55, actually, it's my birthday.
Is that right? Well, how about that? Well, so yeah, you have to be. I think we have to be careful how we. God wants us to be faithful to Him, whatever age we're living in it. If we are right at the end, or whether we're, just in the middle of human history, you just have to be faithful. We have to maintain our position wherever we are. I have heard it said about one of the great Christian leaders of the 18th century or whatever, who I don't know who it was, might have been Spurgeon or something. Maybe it was Spurgeon. Somebody said to him, look, Mr. Spurgeon, if you knew that Jesus was coming back tonight, what would you do? So he opened his diary and said, well, at 10 o'clock, I'll be leading a Bible study here. And then 12 o'clock, I'll be going to visit Joe Blow in hospital because he's sick. And I'm going to comfort him and pray with him. And then at 2 o'clock, I'll be doing something. And then at 7 p.m., I'll be ready. I'll be there to receive, be ready for Christ when he comes. And, if people were expecting that he'd go, Christ is coming, I better do something dramatic. No, he'd just faithfully do whatever he had been doing that was his calling from God. And we're like that too. Wherever we are, we need to be faithful. Whether it's the last night of my life or whether it's my life's going to go on for another 30 years yet. I'll be 100 then.
Perhaps Gog and Magog will make sense one day, but it's currently hidden from us.
Yeah.
It is, but look, may I say that it does appear that descendants of Japheth are going to be involved, because they are descendants of Japheth. We've typically looked at Canaan as being the arch enemy of God's people, but no, Japheth is going to join in and be part of the forces that try and attack Jerusalem.
Yeah, well, God, it says in another place that that all nations will gather together against Jerusalem, and they'll all come to this great Armageddon. That's what Armageddon is. So,
exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
And that Jerusalem will be a burdensome stone to all nations.
Yeah. It will.
It certainly is very prominent, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Far in excess of any other place.
Yes.
It's very small when you look at it on the map,
Yeah.
It's a tiny little thing.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been developed into an interesting part of the discussion, so I appreciate contributions, Trevor, and the others. Now, anyone else for anything more? Okay, well, look, I think we might be about there. Kevin, did you want to
I
cease
think
recording now?
it'd be nice to actually keep the recording relatively short and sweet compared with our usual length. So I will terminate the recording at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Yes.
The discussion was very lively, and I think it's quite worthwhile. So
Well, thank you, everyone.
bye to all our YouTube viewers.